This is the story of how the West underdeveloped Africa. Many in the Western world brush the nation's underdevelopment off as African laziness. Some even blame the African underdevelopment on the African continent being too resourceful, leading to such laziness. Rather than viewing the African underdevelopment as a result of laziness, I will show why the underdevelopment is seen through a lens of dependency theory, explains why it is underdeveloped. Dependency theory is the idea that posits that wealthy nations exploit poor nations by keeping them in a position of economic subservience, thus preventing true development and industrialization. Namely, that Western nation has deliberately made African nations dependent on the Western nations to keep Africa in a state of poverty and securing the Western nations' ability to import raw materials cheaply from Africa as a result. Obviously, Africa underwent brutal colonialism in the 1900s, leading to borders being drawn with no understanding of different cultural and ethnic groups in the country, leading to many tensions. Vast amount of land and subsistence culture was eroded to make space for growing produce that the Europeans wanted to ship back home, having no regard for the fact that the Africans actually needed to live off this land as well. The Europeans opted to grow cash crops such as coffee and cotton, forcing African farmers into a system of monoculture, depleting their soil from the ability to grow their previous livelihood and leaving them vulnerable to price fluctuations for their new products, a state of insecurity still seen today. These colonial powers also neglected to invest in education, healthcare, or any real kind of infrastructure. The artificial countries being created meant that after the Europeans finally left, African countries consisted of many different ethnic groups, speaking many different languages, and having previously completely different cultures and religions. These groups now needing to try and work together. This unsurprisingly led to many conflicts, as it would anywhere in the world. The number of ethnic groups in many of these artificial African countries far outweighed any such number of ethnic groups that would be found in any naturally created country. As the horrors of European colonialism finally drew to an end, it was a time of joy and hope. During the 60s and 70s, sub-Saharan African growth rate was highly respectable, at around 1.6% annually, matching the growth rates of many developed countries when they were developing. This was while they were using the quote-unquote wrong policies according to neoliberal thinkers, as they were largely state-driven and highly protectionist. In the 1980s, this growth suddenly stopped, and their economies stagnated. What happened during this time? The answer is policy changes. They were forced into so-called structural adjustment programs by the rich nations in the Western world. These structural adjustment programs, SAPs, are a clear example of how dependency theory operates in practice. By imposing market liberalization and trade policies that forced African industries to compete prematurely with well-established Western industries, the IMF and the World Bank locked African economies into a cycle of dependence. African countries were relegated to the role of primary commodity exporters, unable to develop the industrial base needed for sustainable growth. This system ensures that wealthier nations maintain access to cheap resources, while African nations remain dependent on imports of high-value goods from the developed world. This African continued underdevelopment is namely in big part thanks to unfavorable deals forced upon them by the IMF and the World Bank, controlled by the Western nations. These deals they were forced to participate in forced the African nations to open their borders fully for international free market policies. The IMF and the World Bank holds a voting system which largely results in a $1, one vote, which obviously unfavors developing countries, as they already developed nations of the Western world can impose policies on poorer countries that favor themselves greatly. by suddenly exposing Africans' immature industries to international competitions. These policies led to the imminent collapse of the few industrial sectors that these African nations had managed to build up in the 60s and 70s. As the industrial sectors couldn't handle the competition, and the World Bank demanded that African nations upped their amount of exports, African nations had no other choice than to go back to exporting primary commodities such as coffee, cocoa, and copper, commodities which in no way could lead to the needed growth rate of African countries. We can see over the last 50 years Africa's amount of income coming from the manufacturing has also fallen significantly. This is again because of the same policies forced upon them. It is simply the case that no nation develops successfully just from agriculture and raw mineral extraction alone. The manufacturing compartment is needed as well, but as Western firms were allowed to enter Africa and use their established economic power and capabilities, no African manufacturers could compete, leading to the inevitable demise of African manufacturing. And as foreign firms bought previously state-owned mines or land, this meant a stark reduction in revenue being generated for the state. This is also a deliberate tactic used by the Western nations, keeping Africans' own ability to manufacture their products impossible. The Western nations can enjoy the benefit of these raw materials, which they can now purchase at very cheap prices, and use these raw materials to make their own companies lots of money and keep their own nations wealthy. This has also put African nations in a cycle of being an exporter of low value commodities, an importer of finished goods, which means African nations rely on selling cheap items and purchasing expensive manufactured goods, keeping them in a never-ending state of underdevelopment. The Western countries also only have 4 or 5 large multinational companies which are buying these raw materials. These companies collude to make sure that the prices are as cheap as entirely possible. And the worse the working conditions, the cheaper the produce as well, which obviously means the working conditions are horrible. According to dependency theory, this collapse of African manufacturing was not just an unfortunate consequence of global competition, but part of a larger system that ensures African economies remain on the periphery of the global economic system. By stripping away protectionist policies that could nurture local industries, African nations were locked into a subordinate role as suppliers of raw materials to wealthier nations. This dependence ensures that African nations remain underdeveloped, unable to build the self-sustaining industries needed to compete on the global stage. This opening of exporting to Western nations also meant that large farms in Africa were now used mainly to export food to Western nations, which caused the development of Africa's rural areas to be neglected. The food insecurity we see in Africa now is not something which existed in Africa prior to its colonization. Debt traps have also been a deliberate tactic used by the United States, where they would force upon the African nation unfavorable loans, and when they inevitably weren't able to honor them, the United States now were able to seize control over parts of these nations. If an African leader declined these loans, the United States would make sure to replace the leader with one who was more America friendly. The IMF and World Bank were also lucky in the sense that when they were issuing many of these loans back in the 80s, it was during a time when Africa had been hit by large famines due to weather and remnants of colonial soil depletions. What can you do when people are starving and famine has hit your country? Of course, the African nations were in no position to reject loans, but these loans came with the unfavorable conditions of open markets as discussed previously. Another point was that developing nations often lack the system in place to properly collect taxes from the people. So for many of these nations, tariffs were the easiest tax to collect and often the greatest revenue for the state. So this removal of tariffs decreased the revenue for the state and thus reduced any kind of investment in the country's infrastructure and people. Many people mention African corruption as a leading cause of the underdevelopment, saying that there exist major issues with corruption within Africa's leadership. While this is undoubtedly true, corruption is neither a uniquely African issue, nor is there something within the African culture or DNA that makes them more susceptible to corruption. Again, the SAPs demanded deregulation and privatization of African state-owned enterprises. This often led to these enterprises being sold much too cheaply to politically connected individuals or corporations. For example, in a country like Kenya, this led to oligarchies being created, as a few well-connected and already wealthy individuals were able to purchase a much too large part of these state-owned enterprises, causing wealth to accumulate in few individual hands. As African nations were recently liberated, and these countries had been fabricated by power-hungry colonizers, it meant that these countries existing of many cultures and many languages were still in the developing part of creating transparent and well-functioning institutions. As this hadn't been able to mature yet, the privatization of the state-owned enterprises came at a time with absence of much needed transparency and well-functioning institutions that could guarantee it was done in a good manner. And as the countries had also lost much of their state revenue, as discussed earlier, it meant that their institutions' ability to function was handicapped even further. And as time goes on, with the debt they had been subjected to by Western nations, this meant that African nations in many ways had to allocate a large part of their resources to paying back loans, instead of being able to invest it in state institutions and infrastructure. It is now no wonder that corruption has been able to take a strong footing, as the Western nations made sure that African nations had no way of investing in their own state's development. Privatized enterprises don't have the same ability to wait for delayed success as state-owned ones, but as the state enterprises were forced to privatize, the motivation shifted heavily to a more short-term profit. Instead of taking part in developing the countries in all other developed nations, state-run enterprises have been a huge part of building up strong industries and creating large amount of stable jobs. This is because states have both greater resources and can handle more short-term laws for long-term reward, allowing them to have greater foresight and develop enterprises that are great to reward their countries. An obvious example is Singapore Airlines, which was state-owned for a long time, until it was mature enough and was able to be privatized. African enterprises were not allowed to mature. This force into international free market policies is something which no other developed countries were forced into during their development. In fact, all these countries we see as highly free market oriented all used highly protectionist policies during their growth, as countries need to let other industries mature before exposing them to international competition. This is known as infant industries. Just like a kid needs to go through school and mature before joining the job market, so do industries also need to grow and mature before entering the international arena. USA and Britain, two of the leading neoliberal countries, were also two of the most protectionist and state-driven countries when they were developing. Similarly, Western countries all had very lax policies regarding other countries' international property rights, something they needed in order to learn from other nations and develop their own abilities. This favor has in no way been granted Africa, as the international property rights declared by the IMF and the World Bank are extremely strict. Africa could just as well develop as any other country. What is needed is policy changes and a stop to the exploitation induced by the developed Western nations. We need to use our voices to advocate for debt relief, a termination of these unfair deals that African nations have been subjected to, as well as African nations should be paid reparations for the countries they were colonized by previously. It is only right that European nations give back at least some of the wealth which they got from exploiting African nations. This is merely a short overview of how the Western world has exploited Africa, but I hoped to shed some light on the more important points. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe. Thank you for listening.